Sonic and the Black Knight is so much better than I was expecting it to be, and I'm so happy about that. I tried playing it a while ago, got maybe an hour in, and just couldn't get into it for whatever reason. This time, though, the exact opposite happened. I was actually pretty demotivated from working on stuff for my main channel, laying in bed hoping to get some spark of inspiration, doom scrolling on TikTok. The final boss cutscene from Sonic and the Secret Rings came up because the uploader was complimenting its animation, especially for its age, and I couldn't agree more. The full animations in the storybook games look incredible. Anyway, that made me really want to play Black Knight out of nowhere because I've been wanting to play it for a long time and just haven't for various reasons. That changes today though. And it's pulled me out of a slump of not being motivated, so that's already a huge positive. I do want to preface this though by saying I think you should try to play the game if you're able, especially if you're already a Sonic fan and haven't played it yet. The game's story deserves to be experienced rather than told. The Attract mode is the game's trailer, which is mostly just a cutscene of Sonic slashing through some enemies and a little bit of cinematic gameplay, and honestly, it shows off the game really well. This game is heavily about style and just being cool. That's very obvious during the opening cutscenes, opening on a raven picking at a corpse, immediately setting a very weird tone. First of all, the raven is pretty high fidelity for what you'd expect out of a 2009 Wii Sonic game. The grass doesn't look cartoonish at all or anything of the sort. The corvid flies off and the camera cuts to a girl running from a weirdly proportioned guy in armor with comically large pauldrons on a flying horse. The tone shift sounds a lot more dramatic than it is, and honestly, if you just let yourself get immersed, I do think this is pretty cool. The guy on the horse, who we shortly learn is King Arthur, seems to cut the sky, revealing darkness that creatures pour out of. Already, this is a great setup. We have themes of death, much more serious tones than you'd expect out of a Sonic game, pretty intense atmosphere, and a girl who doesn't seem to fit in with the other characters' designs, but still with some levity in King Arthur's and his goons' designs. Merlina, the girl, then uses some sort of spell to summon a hero as swift as the wind who ends up being, big surprise, Sonic. Falling from the sky, he falls directly on his face in the middle of a dirt path, nearly dropping his chili dogs in the process, which brings up the levity even more. Sonic, noticing what's going on around him, eats one of the chili dogs, throws the other one up in the air, takes out all the creatures who poured out of the darkness, and makes it back to catch the chili dog before it catches the ground. This is a perfect representation of his character in this game. He's quick to help, and he also fully knows he's a badass, and it's awesome. He tries to attack King Arthur, but Merlina stops him, teleporting the two of them away, making him drop his chili dog. I haven't actually gotten very far in the game as of writing this, but I'm sure that detail warrants mentioning. Arthur tells his knights to hunt down the two and slay them on sight. The knights, Gawain looking like Knuckles, Lancelot looking like Shadow, and Percival looking like Blaze, say that the king has changed and they don't necessarily want to fight Sonic, but they're bound by their honor. Those themes are expanded more on throughout the game though, so I won't go into detail here. Cut back to Sonic and Merlina with exposition about how Arthur is effectively immortal because of the scabbard he carries. Some introductions occur before being thrown into the first tutorial level. The game is on rails, you can only move along a linear path, but you have a bit more control than it might appear at first. Getting good ranks in this game is very difficult, and generally comes down to properly managing your speed and positioning to actually get good combos when taking down enemies, or targets in this case. Don't be fooled, this game does not play itself, even if it can look like that when you're watching someone who's actually good at the game. There are a lot of instances where you can just run past most enemies, but that makes the game far less enjoyable. The game is clearly built around trying to get good ranks, so while it can be easy to trivialize entire levels, think of that more as a way to skip levels you may not enjoy, rather than how you're supposed to get through the game. As we complete levels, we get followers based on how well we did in each level, which functions as an experience bar, and leveling up grants us a new title and some new abilities each time. You can't just grind infinitely off the first level though, as each level only has so many followers you can collect from it. You usually won't hit that cap unless you're actively trying, or get stuck on the 5-star rank for a while, but we don't talk about that. Not yet, anyway. After completing a level, we are also taken to the identification screen. And it's pretty easy to do well enough to identify all the items for these first few levels, but eventually that's not the case, and you won't have enough points to identify everything. You need to triage between either having a lot of lower grade items or a few higher grade items. What items do and how they're used won't come up for a while, but I figure it makes sense to explain this now since it happens literally after every level. Between the levels, a cutscene plays showing Sonic and Merlina talking about Arthur, how he was corrupted by the power of immortality granted by Excalibur's scabbard, and how we can take him out. Sonic is a bit inconsiderate here, making a joke about how the kingdom being plunged into darkness and horror is like Halloween all year round, but Merlina actually bites back a bit, saying no one will be around to enjoy it.
He's plunging his kingdom into a world of horror and chaos.
You mean like a big old haunted house? Haha, this'll be cool! It'll be like Halloween all year long!
Maybe so, but I fear there will be nobody left to enjoy it.
Luckily, there's a fabled sword nearby that'll let us actually take on Arthur and give us a fighting chance. The second tutorial level actually took me a few tries to 5-star. Granted, it was partially because I didn't quite understand the controls yet, but it's also because 5-star ranks are actually difficult in this game, especially compared to S ranks in Sonic Generations, which I just came off of. This level is actually a really good microcosm of the game's level design as a whole, from camera angles obviously designed to be cool, to moments for Sonic to show off, to reaction tests, to the townspeople being infuriatingly placed, making it really difficult to not hit them. I also kind of accidentally discovered that this game has an air dash and a homing attack combo, but I didn't discover the stomp from tapping the jump button a third time until a bit later. Sonic says something about this being too easy, and Merlina says she'll prepare something harder before the Mist Dragon, guardian of the lake where our fabled sword is, suddenly drops out of the sky. It's kind of ambiguous if Merlina was leading us this way and we happened upon the dragon, her just knowing it would show up, or if she specifically called it here, but I guess it doesn't really matter. The dragon fight consists of pressing a button, swinging the Wii remote a couple times, occasionally blocking when it slams its chin onto you. It's incredibly easy, obviously, but Merlina does say it's impressive and is the mark of a true knight, for whatever that's worth. Sonic approaches the sword, Merlina warning him about regicide making him the worst of knights, but Sonic being Sonic, just says he can't be the hero every time before pulling out the sword from the stone. The sword, Caliburn, can apparently talk, and he and Sonic immediately start quipping. This dynamic is pretty definitive of this game, but it's really not that bad. I know a lot of people think their dynamic is annoying, but it's really just a chance to put in a few jokes about the sword being a letter opener and Sonic being a knave or whatever. Arthur shows up, and we give chase, parrying him a few times before attacking, then doing that twice more. The parrying here is not common at all, even though it seems like it was highlighted as an ability of Caliburn, so I don't know why this is the way they decided to introduce using him, but it's a short level, so whatever. We win, but Arthur says Sonic is a poor knight because he has immortality and he's not even worth killing for some reason. A weird but admittedly short sequence.
It is you, sir, who lacks the proper fighting skills. Ha! A fool of a knight, not even worth slaying.
Also, Arthur's voice reminds me a lot of Maze from Fable. I just thought that was funny. Our next goal is to find Nemu, which is a weird way to pronounce that name, in order to find out how to nullify the effects of the scabbard. This next level, which takes about 15 seconds to run through, took me about 15 minutes to get 5 stars on, since you need to hit most of the targets while hitting as few of the townsperson cutouts as possible. I think chains, combos, and types of attacks, such as double and triple attacks, are the most important thing for the score. Learning that, on top of how the attacks actually work, is what made this level take so long, but I did eventually get 5 stars, and maxed out the followers for this level. Caliburn tells us his edge is blunt, so we actually need to find a smithy before going to Nemu. Out of nowhere, Merlina, seemingly thinking out loud, asks why flowers bloom if they're only beautiful for such a short time and are destined to wither. This is immediately moved past, Merlina brushing it off by saying she would be recognized and can't enter the town, but I want to talk about that for a second. It is completely out of nowhere and is very heavy for seemingly no reason, but the theme of death has already been pretty heavily established, especially pertaining to Merlina, considering she's the one who brought up that it's unlikely people survive Arthur's onslaught and how the Raven was juxtaposed with her in the opening cutscene. It's clear that it's something that's on her mind frequently, and it kind of defines her character, while still somehow being hopeful. It's an internal struggle for her, and while we don't see much of it right now, it is arguably the main theme of the game. Why go on if we'll only fall in the end? Well, for me right now, it's to have a good time playing Sonic, so let's move on to the Castletown level. I spent nearly 30 minutes on this level, trying my hardest to get 5 stars, and I think that time really helped me appreciate this game for more than the spectacle aspect. Don't get me wrong, the level starts off with a sweeping camera showing off the town gate on a seaside cliff. It's very much flaunting how good it looks and how cool it is, but there's so much more to this game. Even after so long, I was only able to get 4 stars, realizing it'll probably be easier once I unlock some new abilities, but I feel like that does pretty handily show off how much depth there is to this game, and it's not just holding forward and waggling. You can do that, and you'll get to the end of most levels, but that won't get you any good ranks. I actually didn't like Sonic Colors or Generations the first time I played them because my goal was entirely to get to the end of the level, but after going through them, and now this game under the mindset of actually trying to do well, they become much more fun. This game is very heavily about positioning, both to take out enemies and avoid townspeople, speed management, and using your admittedly somewhat limited toolset to do as efficiently and cleanly as possible. How you swing your sword, and especially the movement you do after the combo into the next swing, is influenced by your directional input as well, which means another way to manage your speed. It's not just holding forward the whole time. You can also interact with townspeople, giving you a QuickTime event to give them rings so they can give you a gift. There's a launcher of some sort that you can actually jump over to access a chest, more enemies for a higher score, and a townsperson to give rings to. This is a great positive reinforcement for skipping a part of the level, in this case the thing that actually causes a moment of automation, and it's really simple to do too. The bridge just after is full of enemies and townspeople and is a great opportunity to attempt to practice specifically aiming your attacks, which is arguably one of the hardest parts of learning how to play the game. Moving left and right on a set path can also be a bit hard to get the hang of, but once you're used to the controls, they actually feel pretty good. I'm dreading the day I eventually play Secret Rings with motion controls, but I digress. This is a great first real level, showing off nearly every major aspect of the game that the tutorials didn't. I'm writing this after beating the game because I spent more time after beating the game on this level to really show off what this game culminates to once you're actually good at managing your speed and understanding what attacks to use where, making full use of your moveset and skills. There are some abilities that you wouldn't have at this point in the game, but again, I just want to offer a preview of how incredibly high the seemingly low skill ceiling on this game is, and I honestly still wouldn't even consider myself good at this game. This run I'm showing alone took me over an hour to get, and I'm not even close to most 5 stars in the game. The smithy, who looks and acts exactly like Tails, is how we access using items we can identify, such as revival items if you happen to get hit one too many times, or items that give special effects, such as making specific item types cheaper to identify. That's all I have right now at least. With the sword sharpened, we unlock the ability to use Soul Surge, which is shockingly similar to Chaos Control in Shadow the Hedgehog. Not Shadow Generations, but Shadow 05, where it makes you go through the level really quickly. It also takes out enemies, which takes a good chunk of the energy the ability uses. The energy can be restored by collecting red fairies scattered about levels. Oh yeah, there are fairies. They don't replace rings as such, but they do give you rings most of the time. They can also restore Soul Surge or even just give you points. The Soul Surge tutorial is a good example of how the game doesn't just play itself too, in that while you are just waggling the controller for most of it, since that's the point of Soul Surge, you do have to pay attention to your gauge, and you can go even faster by using the stomp that the game doesn't really teach you about. The goal is to defeat 10 enemies with Soul Surge while on the ground, since Soul Surge behaves differently depending on if you use it in the air or on the ground, but the text is just finish using Soul Surge on the ground, which made it really confusing for a bit. I did eventually figure it out though. There's also a level for the aerial version of Soul Surge, which does the same thing as the grounded level. The next story mission is to get to the Lady of the Lake to learn how to nullify Excalibur's scabbard. The level starts off with riding on the back of a cart while moving back and forth to attack enemies jumping at you from either side of the cart. This functions mostly as a reaction test, but it does feel kind of weird with how long the enemies just hang out there after jumping, and it feels like you have less time than you really do. This would be entirely relieved if the enemies telegraphed which side they were jumping to beforehand, but it's not really an issue. The cart crashes, but we need to keep making our way to the Lady of the Lake. So we hop off and immediately get introduced to an enemy wielding an axe that spins to attack. They're a bit harder than the normal sword guys, but not anything special. There's also a bunch of swinging, spiky things that you need to avoid, along with a mimic at the end of the level that just kind of runs away from you unless you directly run into it. Not really sure what the point of that enemy is. This level isn't quite as interesting as the first, but it switches things up enough that it still feels very fresh. New enemies, level obstacles, and traps, a short section that functions completely differently from everything else, on top of having Soul Surge to just use whenever we want in the level. It's not particularly incredible, but it's a very solid level. As we approach the lake, Sir Lancelot shows up in our way, being obviously not Shadow, but still Shadow. He looks really good in this game. I don't know what it is, he just looks way cooler than Sonic. He also dishes out some pretty heavy insults. The fight consists of blocking his attacks, attacking yourself, and just making sure that you attack when he isn't blocking and while you're not going to get hit. It's very easy. The fight took me 30 seconds on my first attempt, giving me 4 stars, then 17 seconds, netting me that 5th star. The biggest problem with how short the fight is not hearing the music for long enough. It's very, very good. Apparently Sir Lancelot was the strongest of all the Knights of the Round Table, which didn't seem very evident. We did take his sword, which looks really cool and is a sacred sword, so that's nice, I guess. The Lady of the Lake, who looks like Amy, says she's worried about the one who defeats Arthur taking the scabbard and becoming corrupted, so she must test Sonic to make sure he's a true knight. We must free the innocent in Arthur's dungeon, offer compassion to those in need, and defeat the Knights of the Underworld in 3 days. There are now a few bonus missions available, such as defeating 50 enemies in a level with far more than 50 enemies, and giving 80 rings to townspeople, which just means being very careful to defeat all the enemies around one while not hurting them, and then doing the QuickTime event thing a few times. Without going for a good rank, these challenges are nothing special, but if you are trying to get a good rank, they can offer a nice challenge, and they give you upgrades to make the main story missions a little easier via leveling up. They also switch up the pace a bit, which helps the linear nature of the game not feel too samey over time. I don't think it necessarily needs it for that, especially if you're going for ranks anyway, but it is definitely a contributing factor. I wanted to try and get 5 stars on the Reach the Blacksmith mission again, now that I had Soul Surge and was maybe a bit better at the game, but I actually got a lower score because I only went for enemies rather than also giving rings. I also hadn't learned about the perfect hit thing with Soul Surge, which is just attacking with particular timing, which slightly refills the soul gauge, allowing you to use Soul Surge for a little longer. I'll come back and get 5 stars eventually, but for now, I have no idea how to do better. There's also a second Ring Giver mission in Castletown, which is very similar to the other Ring Giver one, just going through a different level. The next story mission is to free people from Arthur's dungeon. It's a little bit more subtle than how I'm about to point it out, and it permeates through the whole game, but Sonic says he's about to prove himself as a knight, and Caliburn is vocally supportive. They bicker a lot, but Caliburn does genuinely want Sonic to succeed, and that's why Sonic is his chosen. Their dialogue becomes more and more like friends as the game goes on. That sounds so gay, and I'm all for it. Anyway, we fire a ballista into a statue, which knocks the statue over into the castle wall. Honestly, for the size of the statue, that seems like some pretty shoddy masonry. The main gimmick of the level, for lack of a better term, as it does show up in lighter forms later on and has obstacles in other levels, is slashing through gates while timing your attacks so as to not get hit by enemies that ambush you. The fixed camera angle can make enemies behind you become unnecessarily annoying. This is a problem throughout the whole game, but you generally don't want to pass enemies without taking them out in the first place, so it's really not a huge issue most of the time. In this scenario, though, they appear behind you in the first place. That said, the camera angle shifts to make that easier, and enemies behind you are less likely to attack, especially if they're off the screen. Not too many enemies show up, but with them surrounding you and in such a tight space, especially with all the townspeople, this level does feel very tense and risky, a lot more so than I expected. Sonic even remarks on how risky it was, and it's rare that a character's dialogue lines up perfectly with what I'm thinking at the time. It's easier for that to happen here, given the game is functionally on rails, but I still think it's worth mentioning. There are also only 2 gates, but most of the level is spent focused on them since it's a pretty short level otherwise. The third and final gate has an explosive cube on the other side of it, so you have to attack the gate, then jump back, wait for the explosion, then head through to finish the level. For as short and seemingly simple as that level is, I think it's once again a pretty good level. It has a focus that no other level focuses on, the enemy encounters escalate on combat from previous parts of the game, and all the townspeople as obstacles are even thematically appropriate. Not particularly incredible, but still very solid. At the end of the level, from the identification screen, I got our Raven's Feather that came with a Dark Souls style lore drop. The description says, "A feather from the wing of King Arthur when he has turned into a raven." As far as I know, that hasn't been established at all and never really comes up. It's not like the raven in the opening cutscene was him, he was actively chasing Merlina, so I don't know why this is mentioned or what it means. Anyway, Sonic, making his way back to the Lady of the Lake to tell her that he has completed her tasks, runs into a child who sounds suspiciously like said lady.
A great big dragon attacked my village! I'm the one who gave it to him, so it's kind of my fault, see?
I honestly didn't notice the voice was similar until rewatching my recording to write this, but that's beside the point. The child's village was taken by a dragon, and it's our job to go save them, even if it means missing the deadline on the lady's challenges to prove ourselves. Caliburn actually wants Sonic to return to the lady now, even if it puts the village of people in danger, but I'll talk about my qualms and solutions to potential plot threads that may bring up later. For now, we have a village to save. The next level is running through a giant open grassy plain to reach the dragon's cave. It is still very much on rails, but it's a very pretty level. We're immediately confronted by a giant knight that takes quite a few hits to take out. Initially, I figured it would attack no matter what, so I used my guard and whatnot to take it out carefully, but it actually staggers with every hit, meaning you can easily take it down with no risk if you just spam quick attacks. There are also lance enemies introduced immediately after. The easiest way to deal with them is by blocking to make them stagger for a moment, but you can also position away from their lances, even if the positioning is really tight when they're in a row, or even parry their lances with a well-timed sword swing of your own. Or you can just use Soul Surge, whatever works for you. Honestly, I think this ended up being one of the most difficult enemies in the game, just because of how careful you need to be with your positioning, or how well you need to time your parry at speed. There are some obstacles to jump over, some spectacle, then an encounter with 2 of the big guys at once. Just make sure you're not attacking while the one in the back is, and you should be fine. There's a short sliding section that doesn't really change much from the normal gameplay, but Caliburn says you can move left and right while sliding, which I think is funny. There's also a small wall you need to climb, with enemies that appear on it. They're the same enemies that can jump at the cart in the previous level, but in a new scenario. One genuinely interesting obstacle, at least in terms of communication and level design, are the big stone pillars that you need to cut down, since we saw some falling during the sweeping camera shot earlier. Their bases are obviously a bit dilapidated, and it's pretty clear that you need to slash through them. The game is really good at naturally communicating a lot of things like this, like potential grind rails, hidden areas, and stuff like slashing out of traps or through doors. The rest of the level is just a few more enemies in a hallway, but at the end, Caliburn asks if there's someone there, which I assume is a prelude to the next level, but it does kind of come out of nowhere. This level is very pretty and introduced a lot, but otherwise is pretty basic. I was gonna say it's my least favorite main level so far, but it's honestly hard to say that any level is my least favorite, because I don't really dislike any of them at all. Caliburn asking if someone was there was to signify that we'd be fighting Gawain. Honestly, the fight is pretty similar to the Shadow fight. Learn to block the combos, attack during downtime, don't attack when he's blocking, that kind of thing. His attacks are all pretty simple too. There's a short combo, a dive, and a dash. Very simple, very easy. Gawain almost commits seppuku, like actually, not just censoring for YouTube, except probably more gruesome if he had gone through with it. Sonic stops him, obviously, telling him there's more to being a knight than serving a king.
What's up with all this drama?
This is where the perfect hit tutorial is. The level is just a string of enemies to attempt to use the perfect hit on, so I won't go into detail there. The next level is in the Crystal Cave, the dragon's domain. An archer enemy type is introduced here, and they're simultaneously the most annoying and the easiest enemy type in the game. They very rarely aim well enough to hit you, but when they do, it's always at the most annoying time possible. They're honestly not bad. There are plenty of ways to avoid them entirely, from Soul Surge to dodging to just blocking until they're done, but sometimes they can ruin a 5-star run just like that. Anyway, this level's gimmick, again, if you can even call it that, is just to have a lot of branching pathways compared to the others. After the first couple enemies, there's a mushroom you can bounce off of to reach a higher path. the game doesn't really expect you to know how to use them quite yet. It forces you to learn them later in the level, so I didn't take this path initially. Immediately afterward, there's another upper path that you actually start on and need to carefully time your jumps to actually stay on. Caliburn also says one of my favorite lines of his in the game.
There's a road down there. That is no excuse for having fallen in the first place.
The game then forces you to learn the mushrooms before putting you in more combat encounters with archers and other big enemies. Arguably the main set piece of this level is jumping between crystal stalactites before running very quickly in a spiral around others. From there, it's just a couple more enemies to the end. This might come off as a bit of a surprise, I know it did for me when I first realized it, but as a whole, this game is very Sonic at its core. What I mean by that is the gameplay and goals are exactly what you'd expect from a Sonic game. As an example, in Sonic Colors, your goal is to defeat as many enemies as possible and collect as many rings as possible while managing your boost, wisps, and still getting to the goal as quickly as possible. In this game, your goal is to defeat as many enemies as possible, collect as many fairies as you can, being careful about your speed so as to not miss potential points or to accidentally lose points because of random townspeople or whatever, while still reaching the goal in as quickly a manner as possible. Despite having the same goal, and honestly feeling very similar in terms of how you want to go about playing the game, the on-rails nature gives it a different vibe, forcing you to continue forward instead of doubling back to get something you missed or whatever. The split paths don't feel the same in this game though. In a game like Generations, the upper path is generally better, but the lower paths just feel like different parts of the level, not necessarily a punishment, and that's reinforced with a lot of red star rings being on those alternate routes. In this game though, they very explicitly and intensely feel like you did something wrong. There are fewer enemies and more obstacles, so it's less engaging, offers fewer points, and is generally worse to get through. The alternate paths, aside from the occasional hidden area like skipping the jump thing in the Castletown level, are very much a gimmick in this game, and I think it works perfectly for how this game is laid out, expecting you to perfect a specific path instead of exploring for a better path. The next mission is the only mission in the game that requires any motion controls that aren't just waggling to swing your sword until the post-game. You have to choose which path to go down, since nearly every path is a split path, but they don't functionally change that much, aside from potential rewards, specific enemies, and sometimes how you need to engage with the main gimmick. You just step into these beams of light, and move your Wii remote to aim the light reflecting off your sword into the crystals to free the townspeople trapped inside. The stage ends as soon as you break the 5th crystal, while normally you need to reach a goal after completing the mission's task. Otherwise, this level isn't particularly unique or interesting, and it goes by pretty quick, as much as it might break up the gameplay if you're just speeding through the necessary objectives. This is immediately followed by a rampage stage where you need to defeat 50 enemies, presumably to get the townspeople actually out of the cave. This is probably the hardest mission in the game to entirely avoid harming any of the townspeople, as they're all clumped together and are mostly near enemies. You need to be very careful about what attacks you use, and potentially even managing your soul gauge to trivialize particularly difficult sections. I do question how the townspeople are expected to get out of this cave with all the pole swinging Sonic has to do, but I digress. Saving the village from the dragon puts us over the allotted time to complete the lady's 3 tasks, but it turns out that the child who told us about the village was actually the lady the whole time. Who would have ever guessed it? Does this mean the lady actually trapped the villagers? Maybe she provoked the dragon? Maybe all the villagers were actually an illusion the whole time. Anyway, more importantly, obviously she thinks Sonic is a true knight because he went to help a village despite being on such a time crunch. Now, does this mean Caliburn is actually unchivalrous? What's the term for that? Anyway, my point is, Caliburn supposedly wanted to do the opposite of what a true knight would, right? But if anything, I feel like Caliburn was just being more pragmatic. It was likely in his mind that the only way to stop King Arthur, and by proxy saving the entire kingdom, was by getting the Lady of the Lake on their side, and one village was worth the entire kingdom. That said, if anything, I'd argue both were correct. Sonic wants to save everyone, and he's confident that he will save everyone no matter what. He plays by his own rules, which I assume either means he knew he could convince the lady even if he took the time to save the village, or he could somehow defeat King Arthur without the lady's help. Those were the plot threads I mentioned earlier, and I think they perfectly fit both characters, in that Sonic is determined and cocky, and Caliburn is pragmatic and serious. And they fit the world itself, in that a world of stories and legend would absolutely be characterized by important characters tricking others into tests and plot twists. Anyway, she tells us that we need all 3 sacred swords to nullify the scabbard and defeat King Arthur. Luckily, we already have 2, Lancelot's and Gawain's, and we just need to take down Percival and take the last sword. But not before doing another optional mission to give rings to people. This mission is actually 2D, which is pretty rare for this game, since the controls are a little bit odd in 2D. It works well for set pieces, but honestly feels a bit clunky here. Honestly, that's probably because the camera is very zoomed out and the level isn't based on speed at all, since you have to stop to give people rings. If they did a 2D level based on speed like the others, I think it would work really well. Here though, it's just kind of annoying. The ring giving levels are generally the worst because you just have to stop constantly and it breaks the pace of the game, but I don't think they're necessarily bad, just a change of pace. If for no other reason, then they make the game feel less repetitive. I just don't expect myself to go back and try to get 5 stars on them anytime soon. There's also another Reach the Goal mission that takes place in the same level as we were introduced to the cart. I haven't really mentioned it, but the game reuses environments a lot, and each level in a specific environment is connected in such a way that it can be strung together in different configurations and lengths. In this case, it's very similar to the level from before, it just goes a little farther past the end of that level. Most of the time, it isn't super noticeable or is changed enough that it doesn't really matter, and the only reason I'm pointing it out here is because it's probably the most notable instance of that in the game. The cart is pretty distinctive for this area. Even then though, most of the enemies are completely different, and the area past the end of the original level is dramatically different, meaning the level largely just feels different anyway. There's a swamp that you have to carefully platform over so as to not fall in and slow down, and then bridge supports you need to cut down to make it across gaps, which is very different from the rest of the game. Our next goal is to find Sir Percival in the mine area. She's the best Sonic character ever conceived of, I love her so much. The level is a mining village, covered in lava, minecart tracks, and plenty of enemies. The minecart rails can be grinded on, which in retrospect is a shockingly underutilized mechanic throughout this game. You use it a bit through this level, as well as sparingly throughout the game, mostly in set pieces, like on the ballista shots in the first King Arthur encounter. Anyway, you're not really required to do any grinding for the vast majority of this level, but it still doesn't feel out of place, which is either a testament to Sonic's character just fitting with the ability, or how well it integrates to the rest of the game, and either way, I think it's pretty interesting to focus on something that doesn't warrant focus whatsoever. Speaking of, why is there lava flowing the currently inhabited town? It seems like there are almost irrigation channels for the lava. What's with that? There's a slight split path ahead, one way being sidling against a cliff, being much slower but leading to a treasure chest, the other grinding along rails and being much quicker but missing the chest. The short grinding section after may honestly be one of my biggest problems with this level. You have to jump over some minecarts, but then jump off of the rail over a small wall of spikes. The problem is that the timing from the minecarts is pretty steady, but then you have to wait a short moment before jumping over the wall. That's only an issue because the grinding is essentially non-existent in a context like this before now, so it's hard to intuit how far you'll jump when you actually need to jump over the spikes. Yeah, a 10-second obstacle is one of my biggest issues with the level. I honestly think that says a lot about this game. There are more split paths with grinding and sidling, but as a little fun fact, you can actually use Soul Surge to quickly boost across the sidling sections. The rocks you have to run at can be split in twain, which is actually a really great way to do an obstacle like this without it feeling slow or scripted, and the lava geysers you have to avoid, especially while sidling, being able to be skipped entirely with a well-timed jump dash, really add a lot to that feeling. You don't just need to stand there and wait for the lava, you can actively find ways to get past it faster. This is the hardest level so far by quite a bit, and the difficulty curve is honestly pretty well demonstrated with the forced precision platforming that you simply didn't have to engage with back in the Dragon's Lair level. Finally, we encounter Percival, and one of my favorite cutscenes in the entire game plays.
I am Percival, Knight of the Round Table, servant of King Arthur. State your name and your master, sir.
I'm Sonic, Sonic the Hedgehog. I have no master, except the wind that blows free.
Very well, Sonic, Knight of the Wind. Prepare for battle!
Bring it on!
This cutscene perfectly displays this game's sense of, coolness. What makes the game cool? And honestly, by extension, Sonic himself. Sonic is a cartoon hedgehog, Blaze is a cartoon cat, but here we are, with them about to duel. The way Sonic says his name and states his master could be so campy, but it honestly feels so cool if you just let it. Knight of the Wind is also just a cool title and perfectly describes what Sonic is. Not just because he's fast, but also his personality and beliefs. His main goal is freedom, as freedom brings happiness and fulfillment. Freedom to live life to the fullest, though I suppose we'll get back to that. The Percival fight is fundamentally no different from any other Knight duel, just block when she attacks, time your attacks between hers, use Soul Surge when you can to get some free damage, all that, but her attacks come out much quicker, she has longer combos, and the way she strings her attacks together can be a lot harder to deal with. Don't get me wrong, it only took me like 3.5 minutes to get 5 stars, and the winning fight only took me about 30 seconds, but she is genuinely much harder than Gawain or Lancelot. Percival nearly falls off a cliff, Sonic saving her at the last moment.
Percival! close.
Why? Why did you...
I guess you could say that Whim is my other master.
Now, the rest of the cutscene is honestly kind of confusing. Caliburn says to save the hugs and kisses for later, and Percival blushes. I can only assume this is out of embarrassment for Sonic being nice to her and Caliburn teasing him, but then Sonic asks Caliburn if he's jealous. Jealous of what? That makes no sense to me. What is there to be jealous of in this situation? Anyway, Caliburn finally names Sonic Knight of the Wind after all this time, and their relationship has really come a long way since the beginning of the game, as easy as it can be to miss. Merlina shows up, thanking Sonic for all he's done, and tells us that King Arthur is on an island called Avalon, so that seems to be our final destination. Before that though, a challenge here is unlocked, and the challenge is to grind to the very end of the level along the minecart rails. Any hit at all will knock you off of the rails, and even just failing to land back on the rails after a jump, which is admittedly pretty difficult to fail most of the time, will immediately send you all the way back to the beginning of the level. Most of the obstacles are minecarts coming in specific intervals, and it's genuinely difficult to dodge every single one. You need to time your jumps nearly perfectly for the final set, then the jump to the goal is extremely easy to fail. You need to go far enough that you activate the goal before actually touching the ground, otherwise you'll be considered not grinding, failing to meet the clear condition. It's not that bad, all things considered, but it definitely is a bit annoying. There are a few other side missions unlocked before we go to Avalon, but to be honest, there's not really anything we haven't seen before. There's one at Camelot Castle that consists of running through every area from all the missions there, so the main part of the town, the areas from the Soul Surge tutorials, even the dungeon where we needed to free the townspeople. It's completely recontextualized, enemies are moved around and all that, but it's difficult if only by virtue of being a long mission, and it's cool to unlock something like this so late in the game. It's a cool way to show off a whole area you've already seen through a new light, especially since we got that for the Deep Woods earlier. There's also a rampage level in the Titanic Plain, and it takes place around the cart things from the 2D Ring Giver mission from earlier, but instead of actually being in 2D, you're running around and past the carts. The last optional mission unlocked is a Rush Hour mission in the Crystal Cave, where you just have to avoid touching any townspeople. Doesn't sound too bad, right? Well, because townspeople just kind of appear seemingly randomly because of the tiny render distance for them on the Wii, it's really annoying, but honestly, if you just take it slow, it's really not that bad. Anyway, time to finally face King Arthur. The Knight of the Wind can finally face the blighted King Arthur and save the kingdom, or whatever. This fight took me a while to understand, if I'm being honest, and even longer to actually successfully complete. At first I thought you were just supposed to use Soul Surge, which you charge by running at full speed, deflecting his projectiles, and doing well-timed blocks to get close to him. Turns out, you actually need to get close enough without Soul Surge and use an aerial Soul Surge to attack him. This puts you in a quick-time event where you need to swing the Wii Remote as Arthur's sword glows, or as the symbol comes up on screen, either way. He only has a few attacks, sword swings, projectiles you can deflect back, and an electric-looking beam that stuns you, and a move where he turns around and charges at you if you fall too far behind, or during certain attacks in the second phase. You also need to make sure your soul gauge is full enough that you stay in the Soul Surge state until the first parry happens during the QTE, which tripped me up quite a bit at first. Basically just make sure you're almost fully charged before actually attacking. During the first phase, the sword swings are only vertical and he only does a few of them. There's also only a few projectiles, and there's only one beam. It's all pretty easy to avoid. After the first hit, the beam upgrades to 3 beams, and the sword does a cross slash that's nearly impossible to dodge, so your best bet is to just block it. He also has some different projectile patterns, rather than a seemingly random scatter that all homes in on you. The second QTE is a lot harder than the first. The timing is very different, and you kind of have to trial and error it. It's also a lot more strict with the timing, so you need to make sure that you swing at exactly the right time. It's pretty difficult, but it's not as bad as the Eraser Jin or Dark Gaia fight or whatever. My 5-star rank took me about 37 seconds, so once you learn it, it is over fast. Anyway, Sonic places the 3 swords, nullifies the immortality from the scabbard, and finally defeats King Arthur.
Yes! I did it!
Obviously the game isn't actually over, we still have a good chunk of the game left. This is only about the 2/3-ish mark at this point. The Knights of the Round Table threaten Merlina with their order from the king at the beginning of the game, despite not having their weapons? What? Regardless, Merlina reveals that the king wasn't real, merely an illusion created by her grandfather. Sonic bursts in and gives Merlina the scabbard, saying it was all that was left of the king. Merlina has wanted the scabbard this whole time to erase what she calls her grandfather's greatest mistake. The kingdom is fleeting, as are all things, and she wants to change that with the power of the scabbard. Honestly, at first, if you don't think about it too much, that seems reasonable. Why would you want what you know and love to end? But, well, we'll talk about that later. For now, I think it's kind of necessary to understand that an axiom of the game's philosophy is that things are given meaning by their ending, so something that is eternal is inherently void of meaning. That'll be elaborated on more later, but I just wanted to establish that now. Anyway, Sonic and the Knights decide to get out of there now, and this cutscene is actually where one of the clips from the Attract mode video comes from. This leads into our next level, where we need to escape the castle before time runs out. The level is around the length you would expect out of a whole world, like we got from the bonus mission at Camelot Castle earlier, but it's just the first level here. Because of the point in the game we're at, there's not really any time to establish the level to lead up to a long mission, but we definitely could have had missions leading up to the fight with King Arthur or something. Either way, all it really does is make this mission a little bit harder to learn, and even then it's not like the level is particularly difficult. It's honestly hard to go into too much detail. A lot of the mission is just more of the stuff that we've done before. Running through enemies, sliding down walls, whatever. There are a couple sections where we have to go through walls of water, either by using Soul Surge or slashing through them, which is a new mechanic. There's also auto-scroller sections that are functionally identical to the carriage from the forest level earlier. They're honestly kind of slow and tedious, but they're not too long or anything, and you can reasonably get through by just waggling. We have a few missions here later that force you to be a bit more careful about it, but for now it's more spectacle than anything. There are some walls to jump up and some obstacles to go around, and that's kind of it. The level isn't bad by any means, it's just kind of stuff we've seen before repackaged. That's a good thing, we're in the climax of the game, it just really makes it hard to go into detail about the level. I still don't really know why the king turned evil out of nowhere. It seems to be implied that Merlina did it somehow, but it's not really explained beyond that. Gawain calls it all a part of Merlina's plot, but if she had the power to make the king turn evil, why didn't she just take the scabbard in the first place? I'm willing to give the game the benefit of the doubt that there was some limit to her power that we don't really know or something, so it's okay with me. I just think it's funny to point out. Sonic chastises the knights for giving up so easily, and the Lady of the Lake shows up and tells them to use their swords to create a barrier and give Sonic a chance to strike. We can now actually play as all three knights in any of the coming missions as we wish to. We can craft weapons and switch knight styles, which are basically just default, combat, and speed. I kept everyone on default, but did play as the knights in their respective area. You don't need to, for whatever reason, but it makes sense to, and I wanted to try them out and see what they were like, especially in levels that were seemingly created to specifically cater to them and their playstyle. I also didn't really engage with the weapon crafting since I didn't want to have to grind for any specific materials or anything, and I really just wanted to see what the other characters were like on their own, with no extraneous modifications or whatever. I started with Sir Gawain for no particular reason. I know I wanted to do Percival last because saving the best for last or whatever. Anyway, Gawain is probably the simplest, as his thing is just being strong. He can also glide, but that's more of an auxiliary option. He has normal attack chains, as well as the option to dive down while gliding into an attack. He doesn't move much when he attacks, made even more obvious by the fact that his Soul Surge is throwing his weapons like boomerangs. He doesn't move at all, doesn't dash forward, just stands there and throws. This makes Gawain the least fun to play as, in my opinion, since he just forgoes momentum and careful control you've been learning throughout the entire game. Though the trade-off is him being much easier to play. His level is pretty simple, just some chains of weird spider enemies leading up to a fortress where we can rescue some prisoners as we make our way through. It becomes painfully apparent very quickly that the diving attack is nearly impossible to control, as it doesn't home in on enemies or anything, so it's really not that useful outside of the lance enemies who just charge forward and can't be attacked normally due to their weapon. Some giant spears fall out of the sky in a speed section, and the only way you can really get hit by them is not noticing that the game is trying to tell you to move in a certain way. Anyway, we can attack some locks to free townspeople and get some extra points while enemies charge at us. The locks in non-2D sections can be annoying to hit, but that might honestly just be a skill issue on my part. Anyway, some breakable walls and a few enemies later, we reach where Gawain must place his weapon to recreate the barrier, revealing a hidden message stating that a sacred sword must pierce the stone to return the power, quote-unquote. Even after beating the game, I'm not entirely positive what that means, but I assume the 3 sacred swords return their power to Excalibur. Gawain says he's never seen Excalibur despite the king wielding the scabbard, so I guess that counts as foreshadowing, but not exactly a hint for what's actually going to happen. That said, I'd be surprised if most people weren't thinking that Caliburn was already a stand-in for Excalibur, being a sacred sword and a stone that has a chosen one or whatever. Before moving on to Lancelot, a challenge unlocks in Gawain's area, so I'm also going to do that with Gawain. It's a die-hard challenge where you have to reach the end without checkpoints. He does say he needs to avoid taking any damage, which I suppose isn't wrong, but it gives a kind of false impression about the difficulty of the level. The obstacles actually work really well with Gawain, the groups of enemies and the obstacles he needs to weave between, because he's focused on combat but can largely ignore a lot of the obstacles on the ground by just gliding. The only problem with that is that you can't move when gliding, so needing to weave around obstacles kind of nullifies that strategy. The groups of flying enemies also works perfectly because a Soul Surge can take care of them much more easily than any other characters could at all. Lancelot's level takes place in a really cool environment. The ground is stark white, but I can't imagine it's snow. I assume it's spores given the abundance of weird plant-esque matter scattered around everywhere. Arguably evidenced more so by the settlement here being abandoned by the townspeople. Lancelot himself controls pretty similarly to Sonic, fittingly, but with a few key differences. He's definitely more focused on combat than speed. His jump attack slows him down much more, for instance, and his swings are a bit slower, likely on part of the Greatsword. His Soul Surge ability, Chaos Punishment, also makes him stop in front of enemies, like his homing attack in 06 for instance, instead of slashing between enemies and keeping up momentum like Sonic. Functionally, it's nearly exactly the same, but in aesthetics it has a very different effect. The obstacles in this level can be really weird too. For instance, there are trees that just sit there and swing a branch back and forth. You can jump over them, but you need to make sure you land carefully between them such that you don't get slapped while jumping again. There are also spiny vines that pop out of the ground, and the swinging spiky, I don't even know what to call them, vine balls? Well, they're returning from an earlier level is my point. The vines pop up after going over ramps, and I'm honestly not sure how to dodge them consistently at all. It seems like jumping gets you farther, but I've landed on the vines despite jumping off the ramp. You can jump then air dash, but that can be weirdly difficult to time. The easiest way I've found is jumping over the ramps entirely, since that doesn't lock your height. Lancelot places a sword, this time revealing a message that says this is one of the stones that seal the Dark Hollow. Which is kind of the point, right? That's why they're here. I guess the name Dark Hollow is new though. Lancelot's bonus level is just getting a 20 hit chain, which normally would be very easy, but here there's weird butterflies that disguise chests as enemies, so you need to remember which chests are actually enemies, and make sure to be careful when opening chests as some have traps inside of them. That's kind of it. This is where I learned that mimics don't count toward the hit combo for whatever reason. The level is pretty straightforward otherwise, and it's a fun little gimmick for a single level. Getting 5 stars on this mission doesn't seem super fun, honestly, but it also doesn't seem that bad. Lancelot is my favorite character by far, both as a character and to play as. She's the most technical by far, and is a more difficult version of Sonic. If I had to try and explain it, her attacks are all different techniques to get and keep momentum, but without the benefit of Sonic's acceleration and aerial attack. Instead, she has thrusts that carry her forward, lunges as part of her combo, and a dashing stab attack in the air. You have to time your combos such that you end them with a thrust to carry you forward, or carefully aim aerial attacks to take out enemies while moving forward. Her movement is also very beneficial for platforming, especially with the aerial dash, and she can run up walls instead of having to slowly jump up them. A good chunk of the level is just moving back and forth on a rock floating down a lava stream, which is just an auto-scroller, but you have a lot more control than with the others that we've come across so far, so it's honestly a lot less annoying. Her Soul Surge is very different from every other character's, as it's entirely controllable. She spins into a tornado of fire, and you have to manually move into enemies to damage them. This, again, really fits with her being much more technical and difficult, but still being about momentum and speed. This level is very much meant to be played as Percival, and that's made most evident by the giant wall you need to climb here. You can play it with Sonic, but this part especially is genuinely terrible. Her double jump and aerial dash are uniquely suited to this level's platforming as well, since Sonic doesn't have the double jump at all. I suppose Gawain would work just fine for the platforming, but that's kind of it. This is genuinely a very fun level that perfectly suits the character it was built for and teaches her mechanics shockingly well. Granted, it's hard to get that with the other characters given their simplicity, and the early levels did that well with Sonic, but I digress. Percival places her sword and a message does show up, but she doesn't say anything about it, instead leaving her fate up to Sonic. Fittingly, Percival's bonus level is the hardest by far of the 3 knights, as you have to complete the entire level while only swinging your sword 10 times in total. It functions both as a challenge and a puzzle, and I think that's really fun, especially when certain movement techniques of hers use sword swings. The easiest way I found to do this is by skipping the first few enemies, as you only need to take out the weird blob things for the wall to disappear. Ignore the flying enemies on the wall, use another swing to take out the next group, and to break the wall, then use Soul Surge to take out the last group. Obviously, there are many other potential solutions, this is just the one that I found. I loved this level and the previous, and I honestly think they're some of my favorites in the entire game. Not my absolute favorites, but they're definitely pretty damn good. Also, this is where I learned that I'm in the video game, so that's pretty cool. For the final chunk of levels, I'll be playing as Sonic again, since that's a story intention or whatever. We reach the dragon's lair, needing to carefully platform over pits and slash through enemies while carefully managing speed and momentum so as to not go flying over the edge. We fly onto a lightning dragon thing? I don't know, we run along it and we need to be careful of enemies while still going fast so it doesn't disappear behind us. These obstacles are honestly really cool since they force you to manage speed and attacks, but remove one of your core pillars to avoid obstacles in the first place, your ability to position. This forces you to make sure you're actually good at the combat, or just have a lot of rings to get through, I guess. But my point is that it's a unique and honestly pretty cool obstacle, as long as your depth perception persists during the weird camera angle. You also can't really ignore the platforming in this level with Soul Surge like you could in a couple others, like the mine with the sidling, since that will just catapult you into the void. You can use it on the lightning dragons, but that can also kill your speed when locking onto enemies, so you can't really use it mindlessly. This is a pretty simple and short level, but it raises the difficulty in a lot of interesting, unique, and fun ways. This next level is the second and final dragon fight, and it's pretty infamous because of a certain duo. I think this is honestly one of the better bosses in the game, and you have to do a bit of platforming before charging the dragon while dodging its fireball attacks, which get more varied and difficult with each hit. At first, it's just a single fireball going down the tunnel, then fireballs that shoot a bunch of projectiles in an oscillating pattern. Enemies start showing up after the first hit as well. The third phase is a lot more interesting, with a lot more enemies and both fireball patterns at once. There are a couple of ways to end this phase. The fastest way to do so is by cutting down a pillar to crush the dragon, which is signified by Sonic saying it looks like you can cut it down, jumping up to the spot where you can cut it when you get close, and being snapped into the cutting something camera angle, like when you're opening the gates or cutting down the wooden bridge supports from earlier. You have to make sure that you time your cuts such that you don't get hit by any of the fireballs or other attacks. You can also get up close to it and attack the horn just like the other two phases, but you need to get close multiple times as it'll throw you off. It also uses this chin slam shockwave attack when you get close enough, which is very easily avoidable by just pressing the block button, exactly the same as the Mist Dragon way back at the beginning of the game.
And he's gonna do the chin move! Unavoidable chin move!
Anyway, Sonic places Caliburn, but the barrier is too weak and fails to hold in the impending darkness from Merlina. Sonic recognizes this as his chance to strike, so we take off to finally face Merlina. First, though, there's a bonus level. This consists of timing kicking blue orbs with Soul Surge onto platforms to take out flying enemies. At first, I thought the blue orbs just force you to jump, so you had to take out the enemies in the air, because I had entirely forgotten that kicking even existed, since you don't have any reason to use it through the entire rest of the game. The mission is interesting, and honestly kind of fun, trying to take out the enemies as quickly as you can with your limited attempts, but needing to kick the orbs makes it so much more annoying than it needed to be, because most people won't remember that the kick even exists in the first place. This would be entirely mitigated by just having Sonic or Caliburn saying something about kicking the orbs at the beginning of the mission, or just using the kick more throughout the game anyway. Ludonarrative dissonance aside, we can finally face the final boss, Merlina the Dark Queen. Sonic asks Merlina why she wanted to, well, do all this. She knows the kingdom must fall at some point. Eventually, this will all become ruin. She wants to tear it down and use the power of the scabbard to create an eternal kingdom.
Is a world that goes on forever.
My sorrow at its ruin runs deeper than the depths of the underworld. Do you not understand?
No, and I don't want to.
This game is about the magical kingdom of Camelot and the Knights of the Round Table, the legendary King Arthur corrupted, but even more so, it's about Sonic himself. What he believes and understands, and by extension, what he lives for. Why he, and honestly, I, think you should continue leaving. We don't get forever. In fact, we don't get long at all. But that's more than nothing, and better than forever. If we got forever, I don't think any of this would mean much. Everything you did would merely be to stave off the eternal boredom that many tomorrows would give you. On the opposite side of that coin, though, everything we do means everything. We only get so long to do everything we're ever going to do, at least as far as we know, so we have to make the most of it. Don't let your mind numb to the joy you're able to experience, and don't let your precious time pass by without making the most of the little you get. If you stop now, that's it. There's nothing else. So do what you can to make the most of the time you have left. We can start the rest of our lives by enjoying the rest of this game, because I'm still having fun. Sonic is barely holding on against Merlina's magic, clashing swords and leading to Caliburn snapping clean in half. Sonic runs at her again and again, being chastised by the knights to leave and being told that he can't do anything to her. He knows he can't flee, he has to do this, and somehow, through the magic in Caliburn or the proclamation of true knighthood, he glows with the light of the sacred sword, prompting the Lady of the Lake to tell the knights to offer Sonic their swords. This makes him transform into the coolest Sonic form by far, Excalibur Sonic, clad in glowing golden armor and wielding Excalibur itself. The fight itself is kind of underwhelming after that, at least in terms of gameplay. The vibe, the music, Sonic, everything else is awesome, but the gameplay itself is a bit lackluster. You just have to dodge a few projectiles, parry some sword swings, like with King Arthur, and then attack her with Soul Surge. She uses a few different swings and stabs, so it can be a little bit difficult to know exactly how to dodge everything, and she does get quite a few projectiles near the end of the fight, but overall it's pretty easy. After a few hits, she turns even darker, shoots far more projectiles, and attacks faster, but one more Soul Surge whittles her down just enough. That thumbs up is so funny, easily the best part of the entire game. It's so good.
Merlina, every world has its end. I know that's kind of sad, but that's why we gotta live life to the fullest in the time we have. At least, that's what I figure.
The knights talk about disbanding since King Arthur is, well, gone, but Caliburn is the sacred sword, the one who decides who is worthy of the crown. Sonic is pronounced the true King Arthur, and he's as baffled as everyone else from that turn of events, and the credits finally play.
So yeah, that's what happened. To think I was called in to be part of the tale of King Arthur. But I gotta tell you, it was no picnic.
Aren't you forgetting something?
What? All the action? All the excitement down to the wire? But man, would have thought I was the real King Arthur. Huh.
That's the lamest excuse ever! You just forgot about our date!
No, it's true, I tell ya. Yikes! No, Amy, wait! Put down that hammer!
Hey! You get back here, Sonic!
The ending is soured a bit by it being revealed after the credits that this whole thing was a retelling by Sonic to explain to Amy why he was late for a date, that he was probably lying about the whole thing, but I choose to believe this actually happened. I mean, secret rings happened, so this gets to as well. After the credits, a few missions are unlocked, starting with a perfect challenge to get through the level without getting hit, which they don't use through the whole rest of the game. For this mission, you're on one of the boats from the previous levels and need to time jumps, blocks, and swings to get to the end of the level. It's one of the hardest missions in the game, but only because it's hard to learn. Once you learn it, executing what the game demands is pretty easy. There's more hit chain challenges, more get to the goal challenges, like one in Misty Lake that actually brings back the blue orbs you need to kick. There's a timed one where you have to reach certain progress markers to restore a timer that's actually kind of hard, more ring giver missions, even an entirely new mission type where you need to collect a set number of hidden green fairies. Worst of all though, there's a new boss fight against Sir Lancelot. This fight is completely different from the first time around. Honestly, it's almost a really good fight. He attacks very quickly, has long combos that require very good timing. You basically need to get perfect blocks to charge your soul gauge meter to do any real damage. It's a very engaging and fun night fight. It's entirely ruined by his ability to use his weird AoE attack at any time, even while he's stun locked in the middle of your soul surge combos. It's impossible to predict when he'll do it, and that makes the fight simply unfun to try and get a good rank on, at least for me. I didn't mean to end on one of the worst things about the game, but basically everything else is really fun. There's just more game to enjoy, and I love that. The main story is very, very fun, getting all good ranks is especially fun, and all the extra stuff is just more fun to be had, especially since it gives you extra levels to try out the characters and see where they excel and where they may fall short of another character. I really can't recommend this game enough if you just like Sonic, as much of the story is really worth experiencing on your own. Don't let the haters slander this game's name any more than they already have. Okay, I guess I need to do an outro. Assuming I am able to actually edit this in a somewhat timely manner, this will be my first video on my second channel. I wanted this to be my first video on my second channel because I wanted, like a somewhat high quality video as the first one. I put a lot of time into this. Obviously, I played a ton of the game. I got a lot of footage. It took me forever to write this script and to finally record it. Jeez. But I had a ton of fun with this game. Highly, highly recommend it. This won't be most of the videos on this channel. Most of the videos on this channel will probably be less scripted, if nothing else. But I do plan on doing more reviews and stuff of this nature. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I love you all, and I don't know how to end this.